Great. Thank you um, very much indeed for the introduction. Um, so I think I should come clean first and state that I'm a painter and not an art historian. And it was as a painter that I began working at the Foundation and the archive. And I was interested when I went in looking for material relating to Arp's use of humor. And his use of humor really is what I would call a critical tool. And although I did find material related to that, which relates to my own painting practice, I'm going to present today about something else, the correspondence between Ian Hamilton Finlay and Hans Arp. Because Finlay, like Arp, has always been important to me. And it's something to do with the economy and directness, the single-mindedness, the bluntness sometimes of Finlay that I love. And those are qualities that I see in Arp as well. But the connections go further than that. And although Finlay may not be a contemporary artist in the sense that, you know, he died in 2006, I think his work still speaks very powerfully to the present. And I think that the connections that come from just looking quite deeply at the formation of some of his ideas are particularly illuminating. So in 1962, the Tate Gallery held a solo exhibition of Arp's work. A catalogue was produced with an essay by the then Tate director Alan Bowness that contained black and white plates and listed the near 200 works that were exhibited. The catalogue also contained 3 pages of Arp's writing in translation, excerpts of essays and poems that had been reprinted from the On My Way, a larger English language publication produced in the States by Winterbourne in 1948. Ian Hamilton Finlay saw the Tate catalogue. It's highly unlikely that he visited the exhibition, for Finlay was living at the time in 2 rooms at 24 Fettes Row in Edinburgh's neoclassical Newtown. Although he describes his life at that time as a hell of tension and fear, and he was in and out of hospitals and clinics treating his acute agoraphobia, this was a fervently productive time for him. Indeed, it can be argued that it was the decisive moment in his creative development, as it marked his shift from being ostensibly a literary poet to a poet that worked in a highly original way with actual physical objects, a tendency that would lead swiftly to poem objects being conceived and situated philosophically and literally outside. When in 1965, Finlay left Edinburgh with Sue, his wife, first temporarily to Gledfield Farm, and then in 1966 to another, Stony Path, in the windswept Pentland Hills. There together, they created a private oasis with object poems placed in the landscape alongside the wildflowers and planting in the gardens. Here, the ramshackle farm and its buildings were transformed into a domestic sanctuary of Little Sparta, an imagined pre-Enlightenment city-state holding out against the bureaucracy of the powers that be from Edinburgh, the so-called Athens of the North. In 1961, from Fettes Row, Finlay had started Poor Old Tired Horse. Taking its title from the lines of a poem by Robert Creeley, Poor Old Tired Horse was a quarterly, small press poetry magazine. Finlay co-edited it with others until its demise in 1967. Although modest in format, comprising of just 4 folded pages, Poor Old Tired Horse was international in scope and blended historic and contemporary avant-garde tendencies with more pastoral and classical idioms. whilst distancing itself from a sort of retrograde Scottish sort of Renaissance tradition. In the fifth edition of Poor Old Tired Horse, which came out in 1962, Finlay included a poem by Hans Arp. It was whilst this edition was circulating that the exhibition at the Tate of Arp's, Arp's visual work was on. And Finlay was an active letter writer, corresponding widely with national and international poets. The poem by Arp, however, had not been requested from Arp, but through the American poet Jerome Rothenberg, who was well known for his translation work. Another important event happened for Finlay during these same few months. Having read a letter in the Times Literary Supplement in May 1962, Finlay became aware of concrete poetry. The letter drew attention to the Brazilian Neugrandes group, and soon after, Finlay received from Augustus de Campo the group's notes on concrete poetry. Although it was not until 1964, so a few years later, that Poor Old Tired Horse dedicated a standalone issue to international concrete poetry, Finlay, Finlay very swiftly, it made a supplement for the next edition of Poor Old Tired Horse in 1963 of the Neugrandes group, as a sort of an insert, if you like. 3 months later, in April, Finlay writes a letter to Arp. In it, he explains that he edits a poetry magazine, a poetry sheet, which is small as he has no money, and he is a poet. He goes on to explain the premise of the publication, to print poems from all over the world, side by side, with no didactic content. And he lists some of the poets whose work he has published. Amongst those, he mentioned Kurt Schwitters, who of course Arp knew well, and who Finlay had also just included in his magazine. Finlay goes on to hope that Arp is not angry, as he explains to him that he has in fact already included one of Arp's poems in Poor Old Tired Horse. And then Finlay explains that he is dedicating a future issue of the magazine to the Russian constructivists, to honor Tatlin, Malevich, Larionov, Goncharova, and the poets and painters of the Russian avant-garde. Finlay explains that he knows Arp's sentence about Malevich and how he painted the crucified image, and that he thus hopes Arp might contribute a small drawing for his future number, perhaps entitled Homage to Malevich. The letter concludes with Finlay explaining that he would not be able to pay for any contribution. I am often hungry, but how much he appreciates Arp's work. It is a wonder and truly beautiful, he says, and gives very, very much joy. It is part of my life. And how he would so like to ask Arp about Hugo Ball and von Duisberg and his other friends. The letter is interesting as it sheds light on Finlay's thinking at this time with respect to the crossover relationship between painters, artists, and poets. Although Finlay's two earlier books of poetry, The Seabed and Other Stories, and The Dancers Inherit the Party from 1960 and 1958, include woodcuts, these were created by another artist. By now citing Schwitters and Arp, Finlay has started to tentatively align himself conceptually as an artist-poet who could work seamlessly across visual and literary disciplines. At this time, alongside his poetry, Finlay was also making objects. These were small handcrafted toys of aeroplanes and animals. Finlay now perhaps saw a way to combine these creative sensibilities, to make them one, to bring them together within a single work, within a single oeuvre. That this may have been learnt from the artist-poets associated with Zurich Dada is again important, as there is a latent Dadaist strain in much of Finlay's work, in how pieces capture the dialectics between rationalism and absurdity, and in their wonderful oppositional nature. Nowhere is this more evident than in the marvelous Battle of Little Sparta, a real confrontation with UK state officialdom in 1983 that concerned the taxable ratings of Little Sparta's Temple of Apollo, a battle enacted with mock tanks and checkpoints manned by his troop of St. Just vigilantes against real state bureaucrats. Finley's letter to Arp refers to Arp's thinking of Malevich and the idea that Malevich painted the crucified image. This idea was contained in one of the excerpts of Arp's writing from the Tate catalogue, in a passage titled Dreamers, that must surely have spoken directly to Finley and resonated with his own personal situation in Fettes Row. Arp writes, "Today, only a few dreamers continue to sacrifice their lives for the sake of clarity. They eat badly and sleep in hard beds. They suffer heat and cold. But when the wings of light flutter around them, all the misery of their lives falls off. And in their bare cells, they sing and proclaim the real suns, the real light." And then Arp continues with a reflection of how through Dada, word and image can come together as one. Dada was more than a kettle drum, a big noise and a joke. Dada protested against the stupidity and vanity of mankind. Amongst the Dadaists, there were martyrs and true believers who sacrificed their lives in search for life and beauty. Ball was one of the great dreamers. He dreamed and believed in poetry and the image. In Flight for the Times, Hugo Ball writes, "The word and image are one. Painters and poets belong together. Christ is image and word. The word and the image have been crucified." And here, this is now Arp, Malevich painted the crucified image, and for this he was crucified by the Russians. The dreamers are still living in the catacombs, within the image, the word, and the music. In August 1963, Finley receives a response from Arp. It is written by Marguerite Arp, Arp's second wife, who managed all his correspondence. As she explains, Arp does not read or write English. She apologizes for the lapse in time. It's been 4 months, saying that the letter arrived when Arp was ill, and how then she had to go to northern Italy for mud bathing, and then the letter got lost. These charming and conversational details match the spirit of Finley's initial letter. She then goes on to explain that Arp will not be able to create a homage to Malevich's drawing, and that due to time and the far too numerous and tiresome requests and questionnaires from universities and editors, she asked Finley not to ask further questions about Arp's friends such as Schwitters and Hugo Ball. Nevertheless, there is considerable warmth in this dismissal. Margaret Arp recognizes that it was through the Tate catalogue that Finley found Arp's writing, and she offers to send him a copy of it if he does not have it. She also points Finley in the direction of On My Way, the compendium from which the Tate extracts were reprinted. On My Way included the compendium from which the, she also points Finley in the direction of On My Way, the compendium from which the Tate extracts were printed. And On My Way included poems and essays alongside original woodcuts and photographs of Arp's sculptures. One of these, which we saw yesterday in Pepe's talk, Human Concretion, is situated sitting unusually without plinth or pedestal amongst a lawn of clover and wild flowers and interacting with nature. The letter concludes with Margaret Arp enclosing a small book from the Denis Serene Gallery in Paris on Arp's work and that of Sophie Tauber, together with two prints the gallery published, one by each of them. This letter in turn solicited another correspondence. In another letter dated from the 17th of February, but with no year, Finley thanks Arp for sending a standing picture, which he sees as astonishingly beautiful. Possibly these are the prints from the Denis Serene Gallery, but this feels unlikely as they're not printed on stiff enough paper to warrant such a description. But as thanks, Finlay sends a folding poem, which he sees as a magic twin to Arp's standing picture. From the drawing that Finlay does to show the poem, this and how it can be arranged, it is likely that this work is standing poem 1, pair appear, which folds. This is it sort of laid out, but you see it in the drawing how it should be arranged. The 8th edition of Poor Old Tired Horse, the one in honor of the Russian avant-garde, is credited as publishing Finlay's first concrete poem. This was, of course, titled Homage to Malevich, and therefore it's possible to see that Arp turning down Finlay's request to make a homage for Malevich resulted in Finlay fulfilling his own brief. What is especially interesting is that Finlay can be seen to be doing this by responding to Arp's writing. This work was also published by Finlay, this work, Homage to Malevich, was also published by Finlay the same year in a loose folio, Rappel, 10 Fauve and Suprematist Poems. The magazine also included a second homage to Malevich, a small drawing done by the gestural painter Peter Stitt, a friend of Finlay's. And in June 1963, so the same time, Finlay had just contributed the poem 20 PS to an exhibition announcement for Stitt at the Edinburgh Partisan Gallery. Here, a typewritten work, somewhat in the spirit of Guillaume Apollinaire's calligrams, where the words arrangement on the page draw a picture, in this instance, a poetic mapping of the lines and colors in one of Stitt's paintings, is coupled by a drawing by Stitt. Finlay's homage to Malevich is very different. The words, as Arp and Ball wrote, are now the image. They're not a description, they are one. Whilst the words allude to the formal composition of Malevich's suprematist painting, The Black Square, the text itself is semantically complex. It is built through the repetition of 4 words, black and block and lack and lock. This opens up self-reflexive ideas associated with the making or construction of the work, the figure, black, the ground, block, countered by both instability, lack, and stability, lock, with black also being able to be described as a lack of light and a block being a locked geometric structure as well as an impediment. These self-referential qualities themselves are similar to the qualities of the Malevich painting that it honors, and like the Malevich, can be seen to impede any further reading into the work itself. It is blunt. But the words black and block also themselves have been hung up and crucified. They have been abused in that they operate as lack and lock and are incomplete. Their wholeness has been sacrificed. A reading that is further evidenced in this, a later version of the homage, where the square form of the original poem has been adapted into the cruciform, where arguably Finlay has further crucified the original poem as an enhanced homage, if you like, to the Malevich who painted the crucified image. In the Rappel version of the homage, it becomes evident that the slab serif Clarendon typeface in the poem is another integral part of the work. Whereas other poems in the Rappel portfolio are written in a modernist sans serif type. In a homage, only the title of the work and Finlay's lowercase initials are. Finlay emulating the way Arp and others autographed work in the lower case to critique ideas of orthodoxy and hierarchy. The black block text is redolent of 19th century hot metal and letterpress printing, demonstrating Finlay's interest in antiquity as much as modernism. It also shows how even in this very first concrete poem, Finlay was foreshadowing his later works, where he moved purposefully away from the modernist typefaces to older, more historically loaded, printed and hand-carved lettering. However, Finlay's use of type was often collaborative, with decisions on such matters sometimes being delegated to the printers and artisans that he worked so closely with. A complication that again seems to resonate with Arp's similar willingness, indeed desire, to subsume authorship to others. but he too often allowed typesetters to freely interpret the purposefully illegible traits in his handwriting in poems which he sent to print. If Arp's unwillingness to create a homage to Malevich can be seen to have helped catalyze the development of one of Finley's most significant early works, I also see a connection between Arp's definition of concrete art as a vehicle to simplify life and his recognition that this is built through nature, with Finley's own acknowledgement of a similar position. In a letter to Stephen Bann in 1966, written in the midst of Britain's concrete poetry boom, Finley bemoans that he is worried that now in Britain concrete is used to mean anything almost except something relating to Max Bill, Mondrian, the early Brazilians, Gomringer, Arp, and Albers. Here, Finley is recognizing the importance of the historical connections between concrete art and poetry. Eugene Gomringer, the Swiss-Brazilian poet who Finley published and corresponded with, articulates this connection with specific reference to art. Gomringer states that Hans Arp, in his manifesto of 1915, wrote, "Such works are constructed of lines, surfaces, forms, and colors, which strive to move beyond the perspective of the merely human to the infinite and the eternal. They thus seek to relinquish the standpoint of the ego." He continues, that is art, concrete art endeavors to change the world and render it more bearable. It strives to free man from perilous madness and vanity and to simplify life. It aims to attune life to nature. Gomringer's assertion that through art, concrete art is in its conjoined visual and written forms strives for emancipation through simplicity by attuning life and nature certainly seems to resonate with Finley's developing position. As early as March 1966, Finley describes the importance of his work as focusing on intelligence and order and eschewing fuss and the self to create works that speak meaningfully to the present and the past, and how, as an avant-gardener, this may lead to the placement of his works in the built and natural environments. I would not want to draw too strong a connection between the underpinning of Arp's work with nature and the natural world and with that of Finley's, but there are undoubtedly conceptual parallels, especially through the prism of the concrete. These, for me, are most evident in the placing of some of Finley's first object works in nature. And it's interesting to note that Finley did in fact find that book on my way, recommended to him by Margaret Arp, with the photographs of Arp's sculpture in the field of wild flowers. Certainly the contextual richness of Finley's early external works, such as The Horizon of Holland from 1965 at Gledfield's Farm, or Cloudboard at Stony Path, can be seen to be in dialogue with such a position. A cloudboard, I like to think, in relation to Arp's cloud pump. However, through the 1970s and 80s, Finley's position was to develop and diverge from the humble association of the concrete with the natural to become more indebted to ideas of nature embodied in 18th century poetic gardens, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and by equating the pastoral and Arcadia with revolutionary potential. A move that can be seen as philosophical and conceptual project that had at its heart the idea of a multidisciplinary form of poesy that could be enacted from the Scottish lowlands while embedded in classical and revolutionary fervor. In 1988, at the height of Finley's neoclassical and revolutionary phase, Finley would proclaim reverence is the Dada of the 1980s, as irreverence was the Dada of 1918. And surely the Dadaist that Finley is most closely associated with is to Arp, whose standing picture he saw as a magic twin to his own object poems, and whose work he describes as a part of his life. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you for that fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. And it's not really a question, it's more of an observation about the journey of your talk. At one point towards the end, I felt we were in a very, it's an obvious point really, in a very black and white world of conceptualism, text, image, prints, and then suddenly the color arrived at the end, and you got photographs of the outdoor realm and the paint. And I don't know Finley's work at all, but can you say a little bit? Is there anything to be said about his engagement with the color aspect of art's contribution beyond the black and white worlds of print and text? Is there anything? Because at the end there, those images were very compelling about
Yeah,
that side of things.
I
I
mean,
wondered if, yeah.
that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting actually to thinking about the color in the text as well, which uh, and how the color in the text, sometimes is chosen by Finley and other times chosen by printers and artisans. So it's not necessary. Which has an openness to it, which I think is particularly kind of appealing, actually. That there's a sort of letting go, which I also see in aspects of art. The movement from the heavy, if you like, tight sheets of conceptual art to this the work being placed in nature, being in dialogue with nature so totally, is one of the things that makes Finley, such an amazing artist. Really, the way that the placement of the sculptures within landscape are in absolute dialogue with each other, that they're not separate, and that is a sort of a complete kind of conceptual leap, and highly original, coming from, I think, that desire of wanting to work out how to make object, from that moment in Fettes Road where he could hardly leave because of his agoraphobia, trying to work with images and objects and words at the same time. I think that the sort of joyous nature of it in landscape, in Arcadia, which becomes much more sort of bold as he moves forward, is a trajectory of the work. I think the photographs you see in color, they're colorful. Obviously, sometimes it's raining in Scotland, so they're not always colorful. But I think the placing of it outside, the dialogue, that broader dialogue, and the slightly sort of, well, I don't want to use the word dreamy, but a slightly sort of, changing seasons of it, and responsiveness is something which, is certainly there. Yeah.
Actually become form, catalog, who's now within colour, everyone else is black and white. And all the artists got quite annoyed because how can we've got colour and we've got black and white? It's the artist.
Right. Now you'd have to ask for black and white. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Interesting.
This is just more of a comment, but I found this talk really fascinating because I never would have put Finley and ARP together. And I think it's kind of a revealing thing to do, because we often tend to follow similarities in order to explain artworks. And I think Finley and ARP, because they had sympathy, but they were very, very different, they inform each other in such fascinating ways. I mean, there's a type of literary gulf and a type of making form of difference between them. But I mean, I feel like I know so much more about ARP and about Finley, and thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I think I mean, when I found the correspondence, realized sort of what it meant in relationship to Finley's first poem, but also the sympathy between the two artists, it sort of made complete sense. And I was surprised that other people hadn't written it or noticed it. but yeah, it seems to resonate on many levels, not just to do with the relationship of poems and images, or painters and poets, but also with this sort of deep respect for nature, although not a depiction of it, and also a sort of oppositional nature, a willing oppositional nature, which is obviously articulated in very different ways. Yeah.